Hi, my name is Mac. I'm from Hello Tomorrow Films, and today I want to talk to you about this guy. This is the Canon C200. We recently picked this up, brought it along to a few weddings, and we wanted to let you know why we think it's amazing for wedding filmmakers. We've been shooting on Canon cameras for a very long time, since the early days of the 5D Mark II, the 7D. Of course, we've used the C300. We've shot tons of weddings on the C100, one of our favorite cameras. We've used brands like Panasonic and Sony, and while those cameras are amazing, we just really find ourselves returning to the Canon cinema line. There's something about that image and the colors and everything about it that we love. For weddings, we shoot primarily on two Canon C100s, and so when we picked the C200 up, we were curious to see how that was gonna work with shooting weddings, and so far we love it. It's still early days for us. We've only shot a handful of weddings with the C200, but we wanted to let you know our first impressions and what we think about it. The first thing we want to talk about is the ergonomics and the physical camera, the actual body itself. This is it. It's a beautiful camera. If you're used to the cinema line, you are very familiar with the look of this. Compared to the C100, it's a little shorter. If you exclude the handle, it's a little shorter, it's a little fatter, and definitely a little heavier. But all around, it's an amazing camera. It's a decently heavy camera. It's a noticeable difference from the C100, but it's not crazy. It's, especially if you're on a monopod, you're not gonna notice. Actually, I kinda like the added weight because it adds for some stability. And then when you pair that with the viewfinder, it just allows you to be nice and sturdy, have a lot of points of contact. I dig it. There's also XLR inputs on the body itself, not on the handle. Very, very handy. A big plus is it is somewhat of a modular system. You can unscrew this top handle. You can actually remove where the display is and mount it directly to the top of the camera if you really want to strip it down. But all around, there are lots of options, and it's a great physical. It's got a great bod. Guys, sweet bod. The biggest improvement we found, of course, the display. Coming from the C100 Mark I, wasn't the sharpest display, wasn't the brightest display. This is a huge improvement. A little bit bigger, definitely sharper. It's still not perfect for bright sunny days of viewing outdoors, but it's definitely an improvement. The viewfinder is a massive improvement because the C100 Mark I, as some of you may know, was horrible. You basically couldn't use it. So this, I'm very, very happy with the viewfinder. If you're familiar with the cinema line, you are of course familiar with the great button layout. All these buttons you can really work by feel, which is great. One thing that took a little getting used to is on the C100 to use the internal ND filters, you would use the little scroll wheel. But for this camera, like the C300, buttons. And it's got 10 stops of ND now, which is so great. So if you're shooting outdoors, high noon sun, and you want to shallow dip the field, you can do that, you're set. We mentioned the weight earlier, and it's noticeable. It doesn't really make gimbal work all that practical. I've seen people be able to mount this on a Ronin M, which we have, but I haven't tried yet. We actually use this on our glide cam, and it works, but it's not ideal. And honestly, we haven't been doing a ton of gimbal work these days. I really like this camera for handheld, but I'm very curious to see how the newly announced Ronin S will work with this camera. I've heard it's doable, although not ideal, but the image quality would be worth it. If you'd like to see us use this camera with the Ronin S and do a detailed video on that, let us know in the comments below. Next up is picture quality. Like many of you, we have wanted Canon to add 4K to the C100 line for a long time. And so when they announced the Canon C200, we were very intrigued because it's not really a replacement of the C100. It kind of fits in between the C300, the C100, and the 4K options are definitely intriguing. There's two 4K options, MP4 UHD and Cinema Raw Lite. Cinema Raw Lite. You shoot the MP4 to two dual SD card slots right there. There's also a C-Fast card slot right there for shooting RAW. The UHD MP4 8-bit footage is beautiful. It is better than I anticipated. I was actually expecting, a minor improvement over the C100, but it's a noticeable, very noticeable difference, and it's beautiful. You're able to actually shoot in 60 frames per second, which is awesome. That paired with the ability to shoot on two SD card slots, either continually or dual record for instant backup, the battery life, all of that, amazing for shooting weddings. We use two 128GB SD cards to record 4K to, and that gets us per card like 112, I think it is, minutes, which is fantastic. We never have to worry about running out of footage on a wedding day with this camera. We love how in post, when we are delivering a 1080 product, but we're using 4K footage, we're able to crop in to either adjust or make a cut where we really need to and we can't switch angles, or if we just want to get it in a little tighter, very, very handy. Of course, like the rest of Canon cinema line, you have a few profile options to shoot in. You can do, you know, EOS standard, wide DR, or the log profiles. You can do C-Log 1 or C-Log 3. There's a weird way to get C-Log 2, which I'll talk about in a bit. Love being able to shoot in log. We shoot in log with our C100s, and having that dynamic range is great. All right, Cinema Raw Lite. This camera can shoot in a RAW codec. Being able to shoot RAW in this size of a camera at this price point, at this weight, with this workflow, it's pretty amazing. When they announced that, we were like, what? So yes, it shoots to CFast cards. There's a slot right there, one slot for it. CFast cards are pretty expensive. The Cinema Raw Lite codec, it makes some pretty big files. We have a 256GB card, and that gets us about 34, I think, minutes of either 4K 24 frames per second in 12-bit or 60 frames per second 4K in 10-bit, which is amazing, but it's not a ton of time for that big of a card. But holy crap, it's worth it. The image is gorgeous. Whoa. YouTube doesn't quite do it justice, neither does Vimeo, but when you're reviewing that footage on a 4 or 5K display, the colors, the skin tone, the dynamic range, just so pretty. The dynamic range in post, okay, so this camera can't shoot in C-Log 2, which gives you a few more stops of dynamic range, but you can interpret the footage in post into C-Log 2. It's a little noisier, but having that option is really, really great. So for our first wedding with this camera, we knew we couldn't shoot RAW a ton throughout the day because we shoot, you know, like 4 or 5 hours sometimes of footage, and we can't really do that with RAW. So we thought, let's select our moments. So let's use it for portrait time with the photographer that will get some moments of the couple together in RAW, great, and maybe some establishing shots. At this first wedding, we were blown away with our first use of it using RAW on actual shoot. It was just stunning. The RAW workflow was definitely something that we were very hesitant and curious about. When this camera was announced, there was no editing system that supported the Cinema Raw Lite codec natively, but as of a couple months ago, both Final Cut and Premiere Pro CC now support this file format natively. We can't speak to Final Cut, but using this footage with Premiere Pro, it's so seamless. You bring your footage in, you have all your metadata there that you can adjust, your white balance, your ISO, all of that. And you can do that right within the program so fast. You can even adjust to your gamma settings. This is where you can switch from C-Log 3 to C-Log 2 and get yourself a couple more stops of dynamic range. It's such a great option to be able to have. And honestly, it felt like working with any other footage from the MP4 of this camera or our C100s. It was maybe like 5% slower. So if you're worried about the RAW workflow with this camera, I'd say don't let that scare you. Next up is low light. Nothing huge to report here. It's definitely better than the C100s. We're not in Sony A7S territory. We probably wouldn't go above 10,000 ISO as far as a usable image goes, but really, really great. No problems for weddings. Sorry, that was a pretty short one. All right, next up, autofocus. We were very, very intrigued when Canon announced dual pixel autofocus. It's been around for a bit on earlier cameras, but not in this iteration. When they announced it on here, they're like, yeah, you'll be able to, with the touchscreen display, you can tap to focus, there'll be face tracking, there'll be all this stuff. We watched YouTube videos on it and we were like, okay, maybe, but I don't, probably it won't be great. We were wrong. And for wedding filmmakers, this is huge. Say you're shooting a speech and you're able to track the face of the speech giver when they're doing a lot of this, or they're pacing or anything like that. It tracks, you don't have to be on the lens the whole time trying to rack focus. The camera takes care of it. And even in really like, we're talking like f1.6 to f2.8. It works quite well within that range. Here's a shot of showing kind of how it works. So the face tracking is amazing. It also has like object detection, which we haven't used a ton yet. but we're excited to. There's also an option to have like this marker that shows you when your focus point is tack sharp. Very, very handy. But for us, the biggest thing is face detection. We also do a lot of corporate work, so for interviews, the face detection thing is unreal. So that is probably like the biggest underdog feature of this camera, the autofocus. Like every camera should have it. Now going back to the C100s, I'm pretty bummed when I have to use it. I'm like, oh, I need that autofocus. Overall, this camera is a huge step up from the Canon C100 and we're in love with it. So if you have any questions, let us know in the comments below or give us a follow over on Instagram and shoot us a direct message. We'd be happy to talk about it. Well, I'd be happy to talk about it. Aaron does not care about techie stuff nearly as much as I do. So yeah, we'll geek out a bit, it'll be fun. If you liked this video, we'd really, really appreciate it if you hit that thumbs up like button thing. And if you would subscribe, that would mean a lot. Otherwise, we'll be posting another video real soon. So check that out and stuff. Cool.